Silver beams of moonlight spilled through the elongated windows of Adrian Faulkner's music studio. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, though he felt no fatigue. Each night he lost himself in the whirlpool of notes and arpeggios, preparing for an upcoming concert at the Royal Theatre. Throughout his professional career, he had performed countless times before sold-out audiences, navigating even the most difficult pieces with effortless grace. But as the pressing date of his next recital approached, an unsettling anxiety tugged at him. He could feel a creative doldrum settling in. Every composition sounded stale, every note echoing in a hollow chamber of monotony. He wanted to break free from this impasse, yearned for a spark that no conventional classical piece could ignite. His eyes settled on the heavy tome of sheet music he'd stacked on a mahogany shelf in an attempt to find something, anything, to push him toward inspiration. Exploration in the dusty corners of a musician's library opened a path to the unknown. In one such corner, Adrian found an odd, ornately bound folio he couldn't recall ever purchasing. The leather cover, cracked and worn at the edges, bore faint gold lettering in a language he couldn't recognize. The letters seemed on the verge of dissolving into the darkness of the hide. Intrigued, he lifted the cover, revealing musty pages lined with musical notation that was as mesmerizing as it was mysterious. It wasn't just the unusual arrangement of notes that intrigued him, but the way they seemed inscribed in an ink that caught the moonlight and gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. He traced the staff lines with his fingertip and felt a slow, creeping chill skim the surface of his skin, as though invisible eyes were watching him the moment he touched those pages. He closed the folio, telling himself it was overdue for a meticulous examination in the morning. That night sleep claimed him fitfully. He dreamed of songs he had never heard, chord progressions weaving through his mind like incantations that stirred the darkness behind his closed eyelids. When at last he awoke and looked at his reflection in the mirror, he noticed how tired and haunted he appeared. The next day, however, curiosity overrode the lingering dread. Adrian was convinced that he had discovered something unique, possibly a forgotten masterpiece. He imagined how unveiling such a piece before the world might resurrect the spark he'd been missing. Failure and timidity had never been part of his personality, so he settled at the piano, opened the folio, and began to decipher the curious score. The moment he pressed the first chord, a wave of disorientation flooded him. Though the immediate sound was no different from any other chord on his grand piano, there was a subtle undertow he struggled to define. It was as though the note had a resonance that reached deep into his marrow, triggering thoughts and half-illusions to flicker at the edges of his consciousness. Shrugging it off, Adrian continued playing, inhaling the swirling mixture of fascination and uncertainty. The music was uncommonly discordant, lurching through abrupt key changes that he found initially jarring, yet something within its structure called to him with an irresistible magnetism, as if it whispered, "Keep going, there is more here." Hours melted away in that hypnotic practice. He found himself flipping page after page, each measure demanding that he stretch the boundaries of his technical mastery. The complexity thrilled him. Hunched over the keys, his body brimmed with a newfound energy, sweat trickling across his brow. In a burst of fervor, he closed the piece with a final resounding chord. Then it happened. A fleeting shape darted across his peripheral vision, near the edge of the piano's polished surface. Gasping, he swiveled in place, only to find the room empty. Adrenaline pulsed in his veins, and he realized he'd been holding his breath. Convinced that he'd worked himself too hard, Adrian took a lengthy break, drinking cold water and attempting to exhale the anxiety that had built up inside him. He vowed to pace himself better going forward, but something hooked him. That night, he returned to the piece after a quick dinner. With the piano pane glimmering beneath overhead lamps, he ventured once more into those haunting measures. As he reached a crescendo, the hairs on his arms stiffened. He felt a presence behind him, never blatant, never in direct sight, more like a whisper upon the nape of his neck. Steeling his nerves, he soldiered through the final bars. Then, more than a mere shape in his peripheral vision, he saw something distinctly. A dark contrail that advanced around his shoulders, like a shadow passing over a corner of the room. It disappeared the moment he spun around, leaving him trembling. Adrian realized it wasn't mere exhaustion. The music carried a power he couldn't rationalize. His heart pounded and a question rang in his mind. What kind of composition was this, and who had written it? Determined to discover the piece's origin, he delved into every resource he had: phone calls and emails to colleagues, fervent searches in archaic archives, music libraries across the city. Nothing turned up a reference to the cryptic folio. The calligraphy and structure didn't match any known style. Weeks passed, and each attempt to play the piece heightened the sense of strangeness. By then it wasn't only illusions or fleeting shadows. He began to hear whispers, soft, urgent voices emanating from corners of the room. They spoke no coherent words, but the disembodied murmurs chilled him to his core. Twice, when he was absolutely certain he was alone, he heard a rasping breath behind him, so close that the back of his neck prickled, as though touched by a chilled finger. These phenomena always occurred as he delved into the deeper passages of the composition. Any rational part of him wanted to abandon the piece, to stash the cursed score and never lift it again, but that magnetism, that haunting call of the melody, strengthened daily. It wounded his pride to suspect fear might prevent him from exploring the boundaries of his artistic possibilities. Gripped by a mixture of compulsion and alarm, Adrian began obsessively practicing the cursed manuscript. He found that if he didn't try to play the piece, he felt physically unwell, racked by migraines and a peculiar tremor in his hands. But whenever he'd resume, the tension dissolved, replaced by a grim sense of calm even as new terrors arose. Around the piano, he placed small cameras to see if he could capture the illusions that kept thwarting his training. Night after night, the cameras recorded him playing hour after hour, posture rigid, eyes cast downward. Yet the recordings revealed only the slightest flickers of shadow, ones any skeptic would dismiss as lens flares or dust particles. Adrian wasn't convinced. He'd felt something more tangible. The sense of being watched was so strong it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him, his world constricted to the keys and the relentless demands of the arrangement. The outside world blurred. Social calls faded, bills piled on the kitchen countertop unopened, and the once lively warmth of his studio dimmed to a hush of perpetual unease. One evening, a new development seized him by surprise. He'd been drilling a particularly brutal sequence of arpeggios near the composition's climax. The notes tumbled out in jagged, rapid successions under his nimble fingers. Suddenly, a suffocating darkness slid over his eyes. He dropped his hands from the piano, heart pounding. The darkness dissipated almost instantly, but then he saw it, a figure standing in the far corner, until it had the hazy outline of a tall, looming presence wearing ragged vestments. Adrian stared, paralyzed, as its silhouette flickered with each lamp's shimmer. The intangible hush in the studio thickened as though the oxygen had been siphoned out. The figure raised a hand, or maybe it was a clawed appendage, and pointed soundlessly at him. In dread and disbelief, Adrian snapped on every light in the studio, only to watch the figure vanish like a smudge of soot dissolving under a wash of soap. He stood still, gripping the edge of the piano, breath ragged and raspy. Over time, the visions grew worse. That same living shadow appeared more frequently, sometimes standing directly behind him, other times on the edge of his reflection in the piano's glossy surface. Each time, it vanished the moment he broke contact with the keys. Despite the horror, an odd sense of progress compelled him to keep going. The piece was reaching deeper into him than any composition he'd performed. He dreaded the illusions, the ghostly forms, but also found a twisted sense of fulfillment in them, like a fever that gnawed at his insides, but also gave him clarity of purpose. He could hear the culminating sections in his mind even when not playing, like an earworm that refused to let him sleep. The final measures of the composition, which he hadn't yet mastered, promised to be an otherworldly crescendo of technical prowess and raw emotional force. Adrian felt certain that unlocking the piece in its entirety would either crown him as a visionary or cut him open from the inside, exposing secrets he was afraid to confront. One night, a particularly vivid nightmare dragged him out of bed. He saw himself on stage, bathed in bright spotlights. The theater was deserted except for one lone silhouette in the front row. Tall, gaunt, draped in tattered cloth. It stared at him with non-existent eyes, a swirling void of darkness that drew him closer. When he tried to play, no sound emerged from the piano's keys. In desperate fear, he hammered the keys until the strings snapped, each break resonating like a shriek across an empty hall. In those nerve-wracking seconds, the spectral figure glided onto the stage, placing a hand against Adrian's chest. A single word echoed through his mind. Mine. He jerked awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding. The lamp on his bedside table flickered for a moment, as if refusing to stay lit. After that night, he moved the cursed folio from his study into his bedroom, as though controlling its proximity might grant him power over it. It didn't help. Instead, the feeling of being stalked seeped into every corner of his home. A fateful decision finally loomed. Adrian's publicist pressed for the concert program's final selection. The musician hesitated, toyed with safer classical staples, yet the cryptic composition had wormed its way into him, overshadowing everything else. On impulse, he submitted it as part of the evening's repertoire, an unheard-of composition that would be premiered for a sold-out audience. His colleagues were excited by the prospect of a rare, undiscovered piece. They saw it as a marketing coup, while Adrian felt a more personal thrill, the chance to share something alive and primal. He practiced relentlessly, driving himself to exhaustion. Each run-through brought new apparitions, new horrors. Often, he would catch sight of the silhouette lurking in the corners of his house. It began to manifest in mirrors, leaning over his shoulder. Sometimes, he felt that if he turned just quickly enough, he would catch its face in full detail. But a part of him was petrified to see more than an outline. More than once, he wondered if he was losing his sanity, if the stress and creative obsession had broken something inside his mind. Yet, as the date approached, focusing on the composition was the only thing that soothed his internal discord. By the evening of the performance, Adrian was a trembling mess. He arrived at the Royal Theatre hours early, wanting time to acclimate himself to the grand piano on stage. The hush of the empty seats felt unsettling, but he found comfort in the familiar weight of the keys under his fingers. A few run-throughs calmed him slightly. The stage lights cast his shadow across the polished floor, and occasionally he misread its subtle shifts as that dark figure prowling in the wings. Just before the house opened, he retreated backstage and tried his best to steady his nerves. Stagehands bustled around, ushers readied the lobby, and the hum of the gathering audience seeped through the walls. He tried a mental exercise in an empty corner, inhaling deeply, exhaling slowly, willing the visions to subside. For a moment, he believed they had. When the show began, the theater lights dimmed as the audience took their seats. The first half of the program went smoothly. Adrian performed with flawless precision, though he couldn't rid himself of a mounting tension. Every measure in the standard repertoire felt mechanical, overshadowed by the knowledge that the cursed score was waiting at the end. His final piece arrived with an almost palpable sense of dread. Announcing it to the audience, Adrian's voice trembled. The theater fell silent, hushed with fascination and mild confusion. Then the opening chord of the cursed composition reverberated through the hall. The effect on the audience was immediate yet subtle. Some stiffened in their seats, others leaned forward as though drawn by an invisible cord. Adrian wasn't oblivious to this reaction. He felt their apprehension mixing with his own. Halfway into the piece, he fell into a near trance, the repeated patterns pulling him deeper. Yet along with the music's power, something else rose in the theater. The shadows at the corners of the stage seemed to inch forward, as though possessed by an unseen intelligence. Adrian's eyes darted about, unsettled, but he locked his gaze on the keys, determined not to lose control. As the tempo accelerated, the swirling darkness in his peripheral vision expanded, forming shapes along the walls and catwalk. The overhead stage lights flickered, prompting murmurs from the crowd. But Adrian pressed on, sweat drenching his collar, every fiber of his being fighting the primal urge to leap away from the piano. He barreled into the climax, hands darting across the keys. The music exploded into a tempest, dissonant chords colliding with thunderous force. The apex arrived, and in that heart-stopping moment, Adrian's mind spun into chaos. Darkness spilled across his vision, and the figure he'd been dreading materialized behind the piano, tall and stately in its rotting garments. Its face was still hidden in shadow, an abyss that drank the light. He sensed it leaning over him, cold breath scraping across his ear. The theater seemed to dissolve, replaced by a yawning void. Just as he thought he'd collapse, he brought the piece to its finale. The last chord echoed, a violent resolution that rattled the hall. Then, in the hush that followed, Adrian wondered if anyone else had seen the manifestation. Panting, hands shaking on the keys, he waited for the audience's response. Applause erupted, thunderous and immediate. It crescendoed like a primal roar, yet it felt distant and hollow to him. He stood and bowed stiffly, searching the crowd for any trace of the phantom. The lights returned to normal, the illusions dissolving into the aftershock of the performance. The figure was gone, or so he believed. During the brief moments of adoration backstage, Adrian found himself fielding a flurry of compliments and anxious queries. Colleagues raved about the originality and emotion of the piece, claiming they had never heard such an evocative arrangement. One musician patted him on the shoulder, telling him he'd witnessed absolute genius on that stage, something so unique it bordered on terrifying. Another asked if he might share the sheet music, but Adrian hedged, feigning ignorance about where it was from. Despite the torrent of admiration, a part of him felt displaced. They were proclaiming a triumph, yet he sensed an unsteady trembling deep within, as though he'd opened a door he might never close. After the auditorium emptied and the staff started packing up, Adrian slipped back on stage to retrieve the folio. He collected it from the piano stand and noticed the pages were noticeably darker at the edges, as though stained by creeping mold. A foul odor, like smoldering earth, wafted from those battered leaves. His stomach churned. He had to see for himself if there was something physically changed. Meticulously, he flipped through the pages, scanning each line of notation. Oddly, certain notes had swollen, as if the ink had welled up from the page. Then he found it, a single new measure, scrawled at the end, where previously there had been nothing but empty staves. A new chord he hadn't played. How could that be possible? Chilled to the core, he snapped the folio shut and hurried out of the theater. That night, rest eluded him. Every time his eyes drifted closed, he heard faint chords trailing through his brain, beckoning him to complete the piece, to play whatever new section had emerged. He tried to ignore it, burying the book under a pile of other scores. Still, the music lingered in his mind like a malignant echo. Over the following days, the presence that had haunted him before became an oppressive fixture. He caught sight of it in reflections, in offhand glances at windows, in corners of every room. The faint whispering and the dreadful sense of never being alone worsened. Friends and family called, congratulating him on his performance, but he barely listened. After one particularly sleepless night, he couldn't contain his compulsion any longer. He uncovered the folio and sat at his piano again. Hands trembling, he played through the entire composition, from the first haunting bar to its overarching finale. The tension mounted relentlessly, and a dark hush enshrouded him. His heart hammered so forcefully that his ribs ached. The final pages unraveled in a storm of notes, culminating with the newly appeared measure he'd discovered. As his fingers struck that chord, something in the room shattered. A mirror, or perhaps the boundary that separated him from whatever force lurked behind the notes. A searing cold wave engulfed him. He felt pressure across his chest, like a giant hand pressing him down. Unable to move or scream, Adrian felt the presence step in front of him. At last he glimpsed its face, a pit of darkness with shifting shapes swirling inside. A vortex of anguish, silent screams. He felt something cold and unstoppable funneling into his body, as though the dark entity was pouring itself into his veins, taking hold of muscle and bone, weaving itself into his being. Then, abruptly, it was gone. The pressure lifted, and Adrian gasped for air. He collapsed onto the piano bench, tears spilling down his cheeks. The room was empty and quiet, but the hush that followed somehow felt worse. He sensed that something fundamental had changed. His reflection in the piano's varnish seemed different. Eyes hollow, cheekbones more pronounced, like some intangible piece of him had been drained away. He touched his face with shaking fingers. How long he sat there, he couldn't say. Time seemed meaningless. In the days that followed, Adrian resumed his engagements, but other musicians noticed a transformation. His playing, though technically brilliant, radiated a harsh intensity that unsettled colleagues and critics. Audiences noticed a chilling aura emanating from each note, as if some intangible tension laced his performances. Whispers spread among listeners that Adrian's concerts, while extraordinary, left them feeling drained and uneasy. At times, he'd make eye contact with someone in the crowd and see an immediate jolt of fear across their face, as if they'd seen something monstrous reflected in his eyes. The cursed folio still lingered in his studio, yet he no longer practiced it daily. He didn't need to. It had burrowed into him. Late one evening, a close friend and conductor arrived unannounced, concerned about Adrian's withdrawn and exhausted appearance. At first, Adrian feigned normalcy, claiming he was merely tired from practicing, but the lines of worry etched across his friend's brow, and the gentle urging to open up overcame him. Quavering, Adrian recounted the visions, the monstrous figure, and the final chord that seemed to bind it to him. With trembling hands, he pulled out the folio, intending to show it as proof. But when he opened it, the pages were empty. Not a single note was left inscribed there. All the notation had vanished as though it had never existed. The bizarre gold lettering on the cover was gone, replaced by ragged leather that bore no markings. At a loss for words, Adrian clutched the book to his chest, feeling its emptiness radiate an even more profound horror. Meanwhile, his friend frowned, skeptical but equally disconcerted by Adrian's haunted expression and the unexplainable blank folio. After that night, the sightings in mirrors lessened and the silhouettes receded. Yet the presence hadn't fully departed. He felt it breathing inside him, or perhaps behind the veil of daily life, constant, awaiting his next performance. Sometimes he'd catch himself humming fragments of the cursed melody without intending to, as though it were a living entity continuing its grim lullaby. Audiences continued to flock to Adrian's recitals, craving the dark mystique of his interpretations, describing them as enthralling yet eerily unsettling. Some speculated that he had tapped into an emotional realm unknown to most musicians. Others left in the middle of performances, claiming they sensed something malevolent emanating from the stage. In his moments of calm, Adrian reflected on the cost of his ambition. The cursed score had brought him to a pinnacle of artistry, but it had taken something from him too, a piece of his soul. The music was no longer contained in a physical manuscript. It was etched deep into his psyche. Late into the night, he would sometimes stare at his reflection and see a faint outline of shadow swirling behind his eyes, as though that entity lurked within him, bound to him through each chord he had played. Discarding the folio might have freed him from the appearances of that awful presence in the corners of his vision, but it hadn't lifted the stain from his spirit. Even so, he continued to play. He told himself that music was his life, that no musician could live without the gift of performance. As the year advanced, rumors followed him from venue to venue. People wanted to witness his enthralling, fear-laced style. Tickets sold out, every seat filled with rapt, uneasy audiences. And each time he stepped onto the stage, Adrian sensed that intangible presence. It was no longer just behind him. At times, it swelled inside him, merging with the passion he poured into every note. The lines between him and that dreaded, formless specter had blurred, leaving him forever tethered to melodies not of his own creation, but gifted cursed by the entity that had chosen him. More than once, as thunderous applause faded and the lights dimmed, he thought he heard that single word, echoing softly, intimately in his ear, "Mine." And he knew, without a doubt, that some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut.